The billionaire's fiancé pushed the maid down the stairs. His next move left everyone speechless. "Get out of my way before I make sure you never work in this house again." Those were the last words Elena Reyes heard before two hands slammed into her back. Then the world tilted, the marble rushed toward her, and everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't looking at the ceiling of the mansion anymore. She was looking at the man she thought would never even remember her name, and he was holding her hand like he was terrified to let go. Welcome back, friends, to another emotional story filled with heartbreak, hope, betrayal, and healing. Today's story will take you through jealousy, injustice, and an unexpected act of kindness that changes everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from tonight? Now, let's step into the story of Elena Reyes and the night that changed her life forever. She had cleaned that staircase 1,000 times, never once imagining it would be the place where her whole life would break apart. The chandelier in the grand foyer of the Whitmore mansion glittered like a frozen waterfall of diamonds, scattering fractured light across the marble floor. It was the kind of house where every surface seemed designed to remind visitors of their smallness. Towering ceilings, gilded frames holding portraits of ancestors who had never worked a day with their hands, and staircases wide enough to fit a small car. Elena Reyes had cleaned that staircase every single morning for the past 3 years. She knew every groove in the marble, every place where the polish had worn thin from decades of expensive shoes. She was 26 years old, though exhaustion often made her look older. Her mother's medical bills had piled up faster than she could work them down, and this job, housekeeper for one of the wealthiest families in Connecticut, was the only thing standing between her family and disaster. "Elena!" The voice was sharp, clipped, belonging to Victoria Sinclair, the billionaire's fiancée. Victoria stood at the top of the stairs in a deep blue gown, diamonds glittering at her throat, her expression already tightening with irritation. "Where is Daniel?" "He was supposed to meet me 20 minutes ago." "I believe Mr. Whitmore is finishing a phone call in his study, ma'am," Elena answered softly, continuing to polish the banister. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She had noticed over the past few weeks the way Daniel's tone softened whenever he spoke to the staff, especially Elena. It wasn't romantic. It was simple decency, something Daniel had always possessed but rarely showed to Victoria in private. Still, insecurity had a way of twisting even the smallest kindness into a threat. "You seem to know an awful lot about where he is these days," Victoria said coldly. Elena looked up, startled. "I just clean the halls near his study, ma'am. That's all." Before Victoria could respond, footsteps echoed from below. Daniel Whitmore appeared in the foyer, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that made him look every bit the billionaire the tabloids described. But his eyes, when they landed on Elena, carried none of the coldness people expected from a man of his wealth. "Elena, thank you for taking care of my mother's favorite vase yesterday. I know it wasn't your job to reset the whole display, but it meant a lot to me," Daniel said warmly, offering a small, genuine smile. It was such a small moment. 3 sentences, a smile, nothing more. But Victoria's spine stiffened as if she had been slapped. Her eyes flicked between Daniel and Elena, jealousy blooming instantly in her chest like poison spreading through water. "Daniel, we're already late," Victoria said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. As Daniel walked past, gently touching Victoria's arm to guide her toward the door, Elena returned to her polishing, unaware of the storm quietly building behind her. She didn't know that Victoria had spent the entire car ride to the gala replaying that moment over and over, convincing herself that the maid was becoming a threat. Later that evening, after the couple returned from their event, Elena was still finishing her late shift, dusting the picture frames along the staircase. Victoria descended the stairs slowly, her heels clicking against marble. Her makeup smudged from tears she refused to explain to anyone. She had overheard 2 guests at the gala whispering about how attentive Daniel had been to household staff during a recent charity dinner, praise that should have made her proud but instead made her feel invisible. "You're still here," Victoria said, her voice low. "Just finishing up, ma'am." "I'll be out of your way soon," Elena replied. "Do you enjoy it? Being so helpful all the time?" Victoria's words dripped with something sharp beneath the surface. Elena hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I just do my job, ma'am." "Your job?" Victoria repeated, stepping closer. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you enjoy being noticed." Elena's stomach tightened with unease. She had learned, over 3 years in this house, to recognize the early signs of Victoria's moods. The tight jaw, the clipped words, the eyes that seemed to search for enemies in every corner. "I don't mean to cause any trouble, Miss Sinclair. I only try to do good work." Victoria's laugh was brittle. "Good work? Is that what they call it now?" Elena said nothing, lowering her eyes and continuing to gather her cleaning supplies, hoping the conversation would end there. She had no way of knowing that this small, tense exchange was only the beginning, the first spark in a fire that jealousy was quietly building inside Victoria's heart, one that would soon consume every ounce of reason she had left. Down the hall, unseen by either woman, Daniel had stopped near his study door, having overheard just enough of the conversation to feel a flicker of concern. He didn't understand yet how deep Victoria's insecurity ran, nor did he understand how close his household was to a night that would change all of their lives forever. He simply shook his head, telling himself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, a bad mood, nothing more. He was wrong. Jealousy doesn't announce itself with a scream. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as concern, until the mask finally slips. 3 weeks passed, and the tension in the Whitmore household grew like a slow-building storm that no one addressed directly. Victoria found new reasons to summon Elena to her private wing, always with some minor complaint, a stain that wasn't there, a vase moved an inch out of place, a curtain not pulled perfectly straight. Each interaction ended the same way. Victoria's voice growing sharper, Elena's shoulders growing tighter, and Daniel remaining blissfully unaware of the quiet cruelty unfolding beneath his own roof. Elena never complained. She couldn't afford to. Every week, she sent nearly half her paycheck to her mother's small apartment in Bridgeport, where Rosa Reyes battled a chronic illness that required constant medication. Elena's younger brother, Mateo, was saving for community college, and Elena had promised herself she would help him get there, no matter what it cost her personally. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Daniel found Elena in the garden, sheltering under the stone archway near the rose bushes, waiting for a break in the storm before continuing her walk to the bus stop. "You don't have a car?" Daniel asked, genuinely surprised, as if the thought had never occurred to him before. "No, sir. The bus works fine most days," Elena said, embarrassed. Without hesitation, Daniel offered to have his driver take her home. Elena tried to refuse, but Daniel insisted, explaining it made no sense for her to stand in the rain when an empty car sat idle in his garage. It was, in his mind, simple decency. In Victoria's mind, watching from an upstairs window, it was betrayal. That night, Victoria confronted Daniel in their private sitting room, her voice trembling with an anger she barely understood herself. "You had your driver take the maid home. Do you have any idea how that looks? She was standing in the rain, Victoria. It's called being a decent human being," Daniel said, bewildered by her reaction. "You never think about how these things look, do you? People talk, Daniel. They already whisper about how close you are with the staff." "Close?" Daniel repeated, incredulous. "I barely speak to her outside of basic courtesy." But Victoria wasn't listening anymore. Her mind had already spiraled into a familiar, painful place, the fear that had haunted her since childhood, watching her own father drift toward other women while her mother quietly disappeared into herself, becoming smaller and smaller until she vanished from the family entirely. Victoria had sworn she would never let that happen to her. She would never become the woman left behind, forgotten, replaced. Meanwhile, Elena's world outside the mansion carried its own quiet heartbreak. Her mother's condition worsened, requiring an expensive new medication not fully covered by insurance. Elena found herself picking up extra shifts, staying later into the evenings, desperate to cover the growing gap in her family's finances. She rarely saw her own apartment except to sleep for a few hours before returning to work. One evening, exhausted beyond words, Elena accidentally knocked over a small decorative clock while dusting the hallway near Victoria's room. It shattered instantly across the floor. Before Elena could even kneel to clean it up, Victoria appeared in the doorway, her face flushing with fury far beyond what the situation warranted. "That clock was a gift from my grandmother," Victoria snapped, her voice cracking with an intensity that startled even herself. "I'm so sorry, Miss Sinclair. I'll replace it immediately. You people never think, do you? You just barge into places you don't belong and destroy things that actually matter." Elena froze, stunned by the venom in Victoria's words. Tears welled in her eyes, not from anger, but from sheer exhaustion and humiliation. She knelt down, silently gathering the broken pieces, her hands trembling. It was in that exact moment that Daniel walked past the hallway, catching the tail end of Victoria's outburst. He stopped, watching Elena's trembling hands, watching the tears she quickly wiped away before anyone could notice. "Victoria," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning she had never heard from him before. "That's enough." Victoria spun around, shocked that he had witnessed her cruelty. For a brief moment, something like shame flickered across her face, but it was quickly buried beneath defensiveness. "She broke something precious to me, Daniel." "It's a clock," Daniel said firmly. "Elena is a person." The words hit Victoria like a slap. She stormed off without another word, leaving Daniel to kneel beside Elena, helping her gather the shattered glass. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "That should never have happened." Elena shook her head, embarrassed by the attention. "It's all right, sir. I'll be more careful." "It's not about being careful," Daniel said, his voice gentle but resolute. "It's about being treated with basic respect." That night, alone in her room, Victoria sat staring at her reflection in the mirror, replaying Daniel's words over and over. "Elena is a person." The sentence echoed painfully, not because she disagreed, but because some small, buried part of her recognized the injustice of her own behavior, and hated herself for it, even as jealousy continued tightening its grip around her heart, refusing to let go. Sometimes the truth arrives not through words, but through a single unguarded moment no one was ever supposed to witness. 2 months later, the Whitmore mansion prepared for its largest annual event, a charity gala honoring the opening of a new children's hospital wing, funded largely by Daniel's family foundation. The house buzzed with activity, caterers filling the kitchen, florists arranging elaborate centerpieces, and household staff working around the clock to ensure everything was perfect. Elena had been assigned to oversee the staircase decorations, a task she took seriously despite her exhaustion. Her mother's health had taken another turn for the worse that week, and Elena had spent the previous night at the hospital, returning home only for a few hours of restless sleep before her shift began. Victoria, meanwhile, had spent the morning fielding compliments from wealthy guests about the elegant, thoughtful details throughout the mansion. Details that, unbeknownst to her, had largely been arranged by Elena's careful eye rather than the expensive event planner Victoria had hired. It was during a quiet moment before the guests arrived that the truth Victoria had long suspected finally surfaced, though not in the way she expected. Daniel had stepped into the kitchen to thank the staff personally before the event began, a habit his late mother had instilled in him years earlier. "I know tonight is going to be exhausting for everyone," he said warmly to the small group gathered near the counters. "But I want you all to know how much I appreciate everything you do for this house. Truly." His eyes landed on Elena, who stood slightly apart from the group, adjusting a stack of folded napkins. "Elena, the staircase looks beautiful. I heard you stayed late 3 nights in a row to get the lighting just right." Elena smiled tiredly. "It was no trouble, sir." "It was trouble," Daniel corrected gently. "And I noticed." "Thank you." It was such a small exchange. Words any decent employer might say to any dedicated employee. But Victoria, standing just outside the kitchen doorway, unseen, felt something inside her snap entirely. She had spent months watching, waiting, convincing herself that her fears were irrational, that Daniel's kindness toward Elena meant nothing. But standing there, watching the warmth in his eyes as he spoke to another woman, however innocent the words, something broke loose inside her that she could no longer control. She retreated to her room before either of them noticed her, her hands trembling, her mind spiraling into dark, irrational places. By the time the gala began that evening, Victoria had convinced herself of a truth that didn't exist, that Daniel's affection for her was fading, replaced slowly, quietly, by feelings for the maid he claimed to see only with basic courtesy. The gala unfolded beautifully for the first 2 hours. Guests mingled beneath the grand chandelier, praising the hospital wing's design, admiring the staircase Elena had spent sleepless nights perfecting. Daniel worked the room with practiced charm, occasionally checking to ensure Victoria was comfortable, unaware of the storm building silently behind her forced smiles. Then, near the top of the staircase, disaster began to unfold. Elena had climbed the stairs briefly to retrieve extra table linens from a closet near the second floor, moving quickly to avoid disrupting the event below. As she descended, arms full of folded fabric, she passed Victoria, who stood near the top step, a half-empty champagne glass trembling in her hand. "Excuse me, Miss Sinclair," Elena said softly, trying to move past. But Victoria didn't step aside. Instead, she stared at Elena with an intensity that made Elena's stomach twist with sudden fear. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Victoria whispered. Her voice slurred slightly from the champagne and the jealousy she could no longer contain. "Always so helpful. Always so perfect. Always right there whenever he needs someone. Miss Sinclair, I don't understand. Stop pretending." Victoria's voice rose, drawing a few curious glances from guests below. "I see the way he looks at you. I see it. Please, Miss Sinclair, I have no idea what you're talking about. I only work here," Elena said, her voice trembling now, the linens still clutched tightly against her chest. "You only work here," Victoria repeated bitterly, stepping closer. Her eyes wild with a pain that had nothing to do with Elena and everything to do with a lifetime of feeling unworthy of love. "That's what they all say. Right before they take everything." "Victoria, please." The engagement question for viewers. What would you do if you were in Elena's place at this very moment, trapped between a woman's uncontrolled jealousy and a staircase that offered no escape? Before Elena could say another word, Victoria's hand shot forward, striking her hard in the chest. Elena stumbled backward, the linens flying from her arms, her feet losing purchase on the top step. For one horrifying second, their eyes met, Victoria's filled with shock at her own actions, Elena's filled with pure terror. Then Elena fell. She tumbled down the marble staircase, her body twisting painfully against each step, gasps and screams erupting from the guests below as chaos exploded through the foyer. Daniel, standing near the entrance greeting a late arrival, turned just in time to see Elena crash onto the marble floor at the bottom of the stairs, her body crumpling into stillness. "Elena!" Daniel's voice tore through the room as he sprinted forward, guests scattering out of his way, Victoria frozen at the top of the stairs, her champagne glass shattering unnoticed at her feet. Her hands trembling as the reality of what she had just done began to crash over her like ice water. In the space of a single heartbeat, an entire life can shatter, and an entire truth can finally come to light. The next few minutes blurred into chaos. Daniel dropped to his knees beside Elena's motionless body, his hands hovering helplessly over her, terrified to move her, terrified she might already be beyond saving. Blood trickled from a small cut near her temple, and her arm was bent at an unnatural angle. "Someone call 911. Now!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking with a fear the guests had never heard from the composed billionaire. Elena's eyes fluttered open weakly, disoriented, pain radiating through every part of her body. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered. "Don't move, Elena. Help is coming. Just stay with me, okay?" "Stay with me," Daniel said, his voice breaking as he gently held her uninjured hand, ignoring the stunned guests, the shattered glass, the chaos unfolding around them. At the top of the stairs, Victoria stood frozen, her face pale with horror at what she had just done. Several guests had witnessed the shove. There was no denying it, no explaining it away. Whispers rippled through the crowd, shock and judgment mixing in equal measure as people began to understand what had actually happened. She pushed her," one guest murmured to another. "I saw it. Victoria pushed her." The ambulance arrived within 12 minutes, though to Daniel, it felt like an eternity. Paramedics carefully stabilized Elena's neck and back before lifting her onto a stretcher, her face pale and pained, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, not from physical pain alone, but from the humiliation of what had just happened in front of dozens of wealthy strangers. Daniel refused to leave her side. He climbed into the ambulance without hesitation, ignoring the panicked calls from his event coordinator, ignoring Victoria's shaking voice calling his name from the mansion's entrance. "Daniel, wait. Please let me explain." Victoria called after him, but he didn't turn around. For the first time since they had met 3 years earlier, Daniel looked at Victoria not with affection, but with something far colder. Disbelief, disappointment, and the dawning realization that the woman he had planned to marry was capable of causing real, physical harm out of unchecked jealousy. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to assess Elena's injuries. 3 fractured ribs, a broken wrist, and a mild concussion. Painful, but thankfully not life-threatening. Daniel sat in the waiting room for hours, his tailored suit stained with Elena's blood, refusing food or rest, his mind replaying the horrifying image of her falling over and over. When he was finally allowed to see her, Elena lay in a hospital bed, her arm in a cast, bruises forming along her side, exhaustion and pain etched deeply into her face. "Mr. Whitmore, you didn't have to come," she whispered weakly. "Of course I came," Daniel said, pulling a chair close to her bedside. "Elena, I am so sorry. I had no idea Victoria was capable of something like this. I should have noticed the signs sooner. I should have protected you." Elena shook her head weakly. "It's not your fault." "It is," Daniel insisted, his voice thick with guilt. "I let my own comfort blind me to what was happening in my own house. I saw the tension between you two, and I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong." It was in that hospital room, sitting beside Elena's bed through the long hours of the night, that Daniel learned the full truth of Elena's circumstances. Her mother's illness, the mounting medical bills, her brother's dream of attending college, the sleepless nights she'd endured working extra shifts just to keep her family from drowning in debt. She hadn't shared any of it before, too proud, too afraid it would cost her the job her family desperately needed. Daniel listened silently, his chest tightening with a mixture of shame and quiet admiration. Here was a woman who had endured months of quiet cruelty, financial desperation, and now physical harm, and yet she had never once complained, never once asked for anything beyond what she had rightfully earned through her work. "I'm going to make this right," Daniel said firmly. "All of it, Elena. Your medical bills, your mother's treatment, everything. Mr. Whitmore, I can't accept." "This isn't charity," Daniel interrupted gently. "This is responsibility. You were hurt in my home, because of my blindness to what was happening around me. Please let me help." Elena, too exhausted and overwhelmed to argue further, finally nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, tears not of humiliation this time, but of overwhelming relief after months of carrying an impossible burden entirely alone. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Victoria sat alone in the now empty ballroom, the remnants of the gala scattered around her. Overturned chairs, abandoned champagne glasses, wilting flowers. She stared at her trembling hands, replaying the shove over and over, unable to escape the horror of what she had done. For the first time in years, Victoria allowed herself to truly confront the depth of her own insecurity, not as an excuse, but as an ugly truth she could no longer hide from. She thought of her mother, quietly disappearing from her father's affections decades earlier. She thought of every moment she had convinced herself that love was something to be won through control rather than trust. And she thought of Elena's face in that final second before she fell. Not anger, not defiance, just simple, undeserved fear. Victoria buried her face in her hands and wept, finally understanding that the very thing she had feared most, losing everything, was now unfolding entirely because of her own actions. Consequences don't wait for permission. They arrive whether we're ready for them or not. News of the incident spread quickly, first through whispered gossip among the gala's wealthy attendees, then through local news outlets eager to cover a scandal involving one of Connecticut's most prominent families. By morning, headlines read, "Billionaire's fiancé allegedly pushes housekeeper down staircase at charity gala." Daniel, exhausted from his overnight vigil at the hospital, returned home briefly to find Victoria sitting silently in the sitting room. Her eyes swollen from crying, a police officer standing nearby taking a statement from one of the gala's guests. "Daniel," Victoria said weakly as he entered. "Please let me explain." "Explain what, Victoria?" Daniel's voice was quiet, controlled, but carrying a weight of disappointment far heavier than anger. "Explain why you pushed an innocent woman down a flight of stairs because you were jealous of a simple thank you?" "I wasn't thinking clearly. I've been so afraid, Daniel, for months, watching you grow closer to her, feeling like I was disappearing." "She works for us," Daniel interrupted sharply. "She has never once given you a reason to feel threatened. This wasn't about her, Victoria. This was about something inside you that you've refused to address for as long as I've known you." Victoria's hands trembled in her lap. "I know I made a horrible mistake." "You didn't make a mistake," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt at control. "A mistake is forgetting an appointment. What you did was assault someone because your insecurity convinced you she was a threat. Elena could have died, Victoria. Do you understand that? She could have died." Victoria said nothing, tears streaming silently down her face, unable to argue against a truth she could no longer deny. Elena's assault charges against Victoria moved forward quickly, supported by multiple eyewitness accounts from gala guests who had seen the shove clearly. Daniel, despite the pressure from his own family's public relations team to minimize the scandal quietly, insisted on supporting Elena fully throughout the legal process, covering her medical expenses and lost wages without hesitation. During Elena's recovery, Daniel visited her regularly, not out of guilt alone, but because he had come to genuinely respect the quiet strength she carried through every hardship life had thrown at her. He met her mother, Rosa, during one hospital visit, moved deeply by the gentle gratitude in the older woman's eyes despite her own declining health. "You've done more for my daughter in these past weeks than most people do in a lifetime," Rosa told Daniel one afternoon, gripping his hand weakly from her hospital bed. "Thank you for seeing her, truly seeing her, when so many others chose not to." Those words stayed with Daniel long after he left the hospital that day. He began to reflect deeply on the life he had built, a life of comfort and privilege that had, for years, blinded him to the struggles of the people working quietly around him. He realized that his relationship with Victoria had been built more on convenience and social expectation than genuine understanding, while his growing respect for Elena's resilience revealed a connection built on something far more authentic. Weeks later, standing before a judge, Victoria formally pleaded guilty to assault, accepting a sentence that included mandatory counseling alongside legal consequences. Daniel did not attend the hearing out of malice, but out of necessity, a final acknowledgement that their engagement and everything it once represented was over. Elena, meanwhile, began her slow physical recovery, supported by Daniel's unwavering assistance and her family's quiet strength. As her body healed, so did something deeper within her, the belief that kindness, patience, and quiet dignity could still be recognized and rewarded, even after suffering deep injustice. It was during this period of healing that Elena and Daniel's relationship began shifting into something neither of them had expected. What started as guilt-driven support slowly transformed into genuine friendship, built on long conversations in hospital waiting rooms and quiet evenings discussing dreams neither of them had dared share with anyone else before. "I want to build something meaningful with the settlement money," Elena confided one evening, sitting on a garden bench outside the rehabilitation center. "Something that helps families like mine, who can't afford proper health care." Daniel listened intently, something warm and admiring blooming in his chest as he watched her speak. Not about revenge or bitterness, but about transforming her pain into purpose for others. "I'll help you build it," he said simply. "Whatever you need." And so, from the wreckage of betrayal and jealousy, something beautiful slowly began to take shape. A partnership built not on wealth or status, but on mutual respect, shared healing, and the quiet, powerful belief that even the darkest moments in life could eventually lead toward meaningful, lasting good. Healing isn't a single moment. It's 1,000 small decisions to keep moving forward, even when the past still aches. 4 months after the incident, Elena stood in front of a modest storefront in a quiet neighborhood in Queens, staring at the empty space that would soon become the community health clinic she had dreamed of during those long, painful nights in the hospital. Daniel stood beside her, holding a set of keys, watching her expression carefully. "It's smaller than I imagined," Elena admitted, a nervous laugh escaping her. "It's exactly the right size to start," Daniel reassured her. "We can always expand once it's established." Elena's recovery had been slow and difficult. Her wrist had healed, though it still ached during cold weather, and the emotional scars from that night lingered longer than the physical ones. She still occasionally flinched at the sound of raised voices near staircases, a small but persistent reminder of the trauma she had endured. But alongside the pain, something new had grown. A quiet resilience, a clearer sense of purpose, and an unexpected friendship with Daniel that continued to deepen with each passing week. He no longer treated her as an employee, nor purely as someone he owed a debt to. He treated her as an equal, someone whose insight and strength he had come to deeply respect. Rose's health, meanwhile, had stabilized significantly thanks to the medical care Daniel had arranged, giving Elena's family a sense of security they hadn't known in years. Matteo had enrolled in his first semester of community college, working toward a degree in nursing, inspired in part by his sister's resilience throughout the ordeal. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Elena admitted one evening, sitting across from Daniel at a quiet diner near the clinic site. "A year ago, I was scrubbing marble floors, barely holding my family together. Now I'm about to open a clinic that could help hundreds of families like mine." "You earned this, Elena. Every bit of it," Daniel said sincerely. "Not because of what happened to you, but because of who you've always been, even when no one was paying attention." Elena smiled softly, warmth spreading through her chest at his words. Their relationship, though still carefully undefined, had grown into something neither of them had expected but both had quietly begun to cherish. Word had reached them recently that Victoria, now several months into her sentence, had begun engaging seriously in the court-mandated counseling program, confronting long-buried childhood wounds tied to abandonment and self-worth. Elena felt no satisfaction in Victoria's punishment, only a quiet hope that genuine healing might still be possible for her, even after everything that had happened. "Do you ever think about forgiving her completely?" Daniel asked one evening, watching Elena carefully. Elena considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I think I already have, in the way that matters most for me. I don't carry hatred for her anymore." But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Daniel. It means I've decided not to let what she did control the rest of my life. Daniel nodded, admiration deepening in his expression. You're one of the strongest people I've ever known. I had to become strong, Elena said simply. Life didn't give me much choice. As the clinic's opening day approached, Elena found herself reflecting often on the strange, painful journey that had led her here. From a frightened housekeeper working herself to exhaustion, to a woman standing confidently at the threshold of a dream she had once thought impossible. The fall down that staircase had nearly destroyed her, both physically and emotionally. But in the wreckage of that terrible night, something unexpected had emerged. Purpose, healing, and an unlikely friendship that continued to grow into something neither of them had planned, but both quietly welcomed into their lives. On the morning the clinic officially opened its doors, Elena stood outside, watching as the first patients, tired mothers, elderly men, exhausted working families just like her own, walked through the entrance, finally receiving the kind of care and dignity so many of them had been denied for years. Daniel stood quietly beside her, watching not the clinic, but Elena herself, marveling at the quiet strength radiating from a woman who had endured so much, yet had chosen compassion and purpose over bitterness and revenge. You did this, he said softly. We did this, Elena corrected gently, glancing at him with a small, grateful smile. And as the late morning sun spilled warmly across the clinic's entrance, casting long shadows against the sidewalk, both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever came next in their lives, it would be built on something far stronger than wealth or status. It would be built on genuine respect, shared healing, and the quiet, unshakable belief that even the darkest falls in life could eventually lead toward the light. Forgiveness, Elena whispered, doesn't mean forgetting what you did to me. It means I refuse to let it define who I become. 6 months had passed since the night Elena Reyes fell down the marble staircase of the Whitmore mansion. 6 months since Daniel Whitmore had knelt beside her broken body on that cold floor. His voice cracking as he screamed for an ambulance. His hands shaking as he held hers and promised she would not be alone. Elena stood now at the entrance of a small community clinic in Queens, New York, not as a patient, but as its newest administrator. The building was modest compared to the Whitmore estate, with peeling paint on the outside and mismatched furniture in the waiting room. But to Elena, it was the most beautiful place she had ever worked. It was hers, built with her own hands, her own decisions, her own dreams. And yes, with Daniel's financial backing, but never his control. She touched the small scar near her hairline, a permanent reminder of that night. The doctors had told her she was lucky. A few inches to the left, and the fall could have been fatal. Ms. Reyes. A young nurse peeked through the doorway. Your 10 o'clock is here. It's Mr. Whitmore. Elena's heart skipped, the way it always did when she heard his name. Send him in. Daniel walked into her office slowly, holding a manila folder. I have news. The court hearing was this morning. Elena's hands tightened around her coffee mug. And Victoria pleaded guilty to assault. She's been sentenced to 18 months, with parole possible after mandatory counseling and community service. The judge said her insecurity had spiraled into something dangerous, and it needed to be addressed, not just punished. Elena nodded slowly. Part of her felt an uncomfortable pang of pity. How do you feel about it? Daniel asked. Relieved, Elena admitted. And a little sad. Victoria wasn't born cruel, Daniel. Something broke inside her long before I ever stepped into that mansion. I hope she finds whatever peace she was looking for. You know, Daniel said, most people wouldn't have that kind of grace. It's not grace, Elena said. It's survival. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to let what happened on those stairs become the only story of my life. I have a bigger one to write. He smiled. Speaking of bigger stories, the Foundation's board approved the expansion. 2 more clinics next year. Yonkers and the Bronx. Elena's breath caught. I still can't believe you're doing all this. I still can't believe I almost didn't, Daniel replied, his voice heavy with old regret. Victoria's jealousy exposed something ugly in our whole world, Elena. Not just in her, but in how easily people like me can become blind to the people who hold everything together behind the scenes. Elena reached across the desk, resting her hand over his. You saw me when it mattered most. That's what I choose to remember. My mother wants to meet you properly, Elena said after a moment, smiling. Not as Mr. Whitmore, my employer's fiancé, but just Daniel. He laughed warmly. I'd like that very much. As Daniel left her office that afternoon, Elena stood by the window, watching him walk toward his car. She thought about the woman she had been 8 months ago, exhausted, invisible, silently carrying the weight of her mother's medical bills and her own dreams deferred. She thought about the terror of falling, the helplessness of lying broken on cold marble, and the surprising redemptive kindness that had risen out of that darkness. She picked up a framed photo on her desk, herself and her mother, taken the day the clinic officially opened. Beneath it sat a small plaque with words she had chosen herself. Kindness is never wasted, even when it takes the long way home. She smiled, turned off the office light, and stepped out into the evening, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. No longer just the maid who fell down the stairs, but the woman who rose from them. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness always finds its way back. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Elena's place? See you in the next story. Yellow heart.